The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 25. Is it them? Singing the doxologer. Awful square. Funeral orgies. A bad investment. The news was all over town in 2 minutes, and you could see the people tearing down on the run from every which way, some of them putting on their coats as they came. Pretty soon it was in the middle of a crowd, and the noise of the tramping was like a soldier march. The windows and dooryards was full, and every minute somebody would say over a fence,
"Is it them?"
and somebody, trotting along with the gang, would answer back and say,
"You bet it is."
When we got to the house, the street in front of it was packed, and the 3 girls was standing in the door. Mary Jane was red-headed, but that don't make no difference. She was most awful beautiful, and her face and her eyes was all lit up like glory. She was so glad her uncles was come. The king he spread his arms, and Mary Jane she jumped for them, and the hare-lip jumped for the duke, and there they had it. Everybody most, leastways women, cried for joy to see them meet again at last and have such a good times. Then the king he hunched the duke private. I see him do it. And then he looked around and see the coffin over in the corner on 2 chairs. So then him and the duke, like a hand across each other's shoulder, and t'other hand to their eyes, walked slow and solemn over there. Everybody dropped back to give them room, and all the talk and the noise stopping, people saying "Sh!" and all the men taking their hats off and drooping their heads, so you could a heard a pin fall. And when they got there they bent over and looked in the coffin, and took one sight. And then they burst out a crying, so you could a heard them to Orleans, most. And then they put their arms around each other's necks, and hung their chins over each other's shoulders, and then for 3 minutes, or maybe 4, I never seen 2 men leak the way they done, and mind you, everybody was doing the same, and the place was that damp I never see anything like it. Then one of them got on one side of the coffin, and t'other on t'other side, and they kneeled down and rested their foreheads on the coffin, and let on to pray all to themselves. Well, when it come to that it worked the crowd like you never see anything like it, and everybody broke down and went to sobbing right out loud. The poor girls too, and every woman, nearly, went up to the girls without saying a word and kissed them solemn on the forehead, and then put their hand on their head and looked up towards the sky with the tears running down, and then busted out and went off sobbing and swabbing, and give the next woman a show. I never see anything so disgustin'. Well, by and by, the king gets up and comes forward a little, and works himself up and sobbers out a speech, all full of tears and flappadoodle about his being a sore trial for him and his poor brother to lose the deceased, and to miss seeing diseased alive, after the long journey of 4,000 mile. But it's a trial that's sweetened and sanctified to us by this dear sympathy and these holy tears, and so he thanks them out of his heart and out of his brother's heart, because out of their mouths they can't, words being too weak and cold, and all that kind of rot and slush, till it was just sickening, and then he blubbers out a pious goody-goody amen, and turns himself loose and goes to crying fit to bust. And the minute the words were out of his mouth, somebody over in the crowd struck up the doxologer, and everybody joined in with all their might, and it just warmed you up and made you feel as good as church letting out. Music is a good thing, and after all that soul butter and hogwash I never see it freshen up things so, and sound so honest and bully. Then the king begins to work his jaw again, and says how him and his nieces would be glad if a few of the main principal friends of the family would take supper here with them this evening, and help set up with the ashes of the deceased, and says if his poor brother laying yonder could speak, he knows who he would name, for they was names that was very dear to him, and mentioned often in his letters, and so he would name the same, to wit as follows: Reverend Mr. Hobson, and Deacon Lonthovey, and Mr. Ben Rucker, and Abner Shackelford, and Levi Bell, and Dr. Robinson, and their wives, and the widow Bartley. Reverend Hobson and Dr. Robinson was down to the end of the town a hunting together, that is, I mean the doctor was shipping a sick man to the other world, and the preacher was pinting him right. Lawyer Bell was away up to Louisville on business, but the rest was on hand, and so they all come and shook hands with the king, and thanked him and talked to him, and then they shook hands with the Duke, and didn't say anything, but just kept a-smiling and bobbing their heads like a passel of sapheads, whilst he made all sorts of signs with his hands, and said goo 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 all the time, like a baby that can't talk. So the king he blattered along, and managed to inquire about pretty much everybody and dog in town by his name, and mentioned all sorts of little things that happened one time or another in the town, or to George's family, or to Peter, and he always let on that Peter wrote him the things, but that was a lie. He got every blessed one of them out of that young flathead that we canoed up to the steamboat. Then Mary Jane she fetched the letter her father left behind, and the king he read it out loud and cried over it. It gave the dwelling house and $3,000, gold, to the girls, and it give the tan yard, which was doing a good business, along with some other houses and land, worth about 7,000, and $3,000 in gold to Harvey and William, and told where the 6,000 cash was hid down cellar. So these two frauds said they'd go and fetch it up, and have everything square and above board, and told me to come with a candle. We shut the cellar door behind us, and when they found the bag they spilt it out on the floor, and it was a lovely sight, all them yaller boys. My, the way the king's eyes did shine! He slaps the Duke on the shoulder and says,
"Oh, this ain't bully nor nothin'. Oh, no, I reckon not. Why, bully, it beats the nonsuch, don't it?"
The Duke allowed it did. They pawed, the yaller boys, and sifted them through their fingers and let them jingle down on the floor, and the king says,
"It ain't no use talkin', bein' brothers to a rich dead man, and representative of furrin heirs. That's got left is the line for you and me, Bilge. This here comes from trustin' to Providence. It's the best way in the long run. I've tried 'em all, and there ain't no better way."
most everybody would have been satisfied with the pile, and took it on trust, but no, they must count it. So they counts it, and it comes out $415 short. Says the king,
"Durnham, I wonder what he's done with that $415.
They worried over that a while, and ransacked all around for it. Then the Duke says,
Well, he was a pretty sick man, and likely he made a mistake. I reckon that's the way of it. The best way's to let it go, and keep still about it. We can spare it."
"Oh, shucks, yes, we can spare it. I don't care nothin' 'bout that. It's the Count I'm thinking about. We want to be awful square and open and above board here, you know. We want to lug this here money upstairs and count it before everybody. Then there ain't nothing suspicious. But when the dead man says there's $6,000, you know, we don't want to—"
Hold on.
says the Duke,
Let's make up the deficit.
and he begun to haul out yaller boys out of his pocket.
"It's a most amazin' good idea, Duke. You've got a rattling clever head on you.
Says the king.
Blessed if the old Nonsuch ain't a-helpin' us out again.
And he began to haul out yaller jackets and stack them up. It most busted them, but they made up the 6,000 clean and clear.
Say,
says the Duke.
I got another idea. Let's go upstairs and count this money and then take and give it to the girls.
Good land, Duke. Let me hug ya. It's the most dazzling idea 'at ever a man struck. You have certainly got the most astonishing head I ever seen. Oh, this is the boss dodge. There ain't no mistake about it. Let 'em fetch along their suspicion now, if they want to. This'll lay 'em out.
When we got upstairs, everybody gathered around the table, and the king he counted it and stacked it up. $300 in a pile, 20 elegant little piles. Everybody looked hungry at it and licked their chops. Then they raked it into the bag again, and I see the king begin to swell himself up for another speech. He says,
Friends all, my poor brother that lays yonder has done generous by them that's left behind in the vale of sorrows. He has done generous by these your poor little lambs that he has loved and sheltered, and that's left fatherless and motherless. Yes, and we that knowed him knows that he would have done more generous by them if he hadn't been afraid of wounding his dear William and me. Now, wouldn't he? There ain't no question about it in my mind. Well, then, what kind of brothers would it be that didn't stand in his way at such a time? And what kind of uncles would it be that didn't rob, yes, rob such poor sweet lambs as these as he loved so at such a time? If I know William, and I think I do, well, I'll just ask him.
He turns around and begins to make a lot of signs to the Duke with his hands, and the Duke he looks at him stupid and leather-headed a while. Then all of a sudden he seems to catch his meanin', and jumps for the king, goo-gooing with all his might for joy, and hugs him about 15 times before he lets up. Then the king says,
I knowed it. I reckon I'll convince everyone the way he feels about it. Here, Mary Jane, Susan, Joanna, take the money, take it all. It's the gift of him that lays yonder, cold but joyful.
Mary Jane she went for him. Susan and the harelip went for the Duke, and then such another hugging and kissing I never see yet. And everybody crowded up with the tears in their eyes, and most shook the hands off of them frauds, saying all the time,
You dear good souls!
How lovely! How could you?
Well then, pretty soon all hands got to talking about the deceased again, and how good he was, and what a loss he was, and all that. And before long a big iron-jawed man worked himself in there from outside, and stood a-listening and looking, and not saying anything, and nobody saying anything to him either, because the king was talking and they was all busy listening. The king was saying, in the middle of something he started in on.
They being particular friends of the diseased. That's why they're invited here this evening. But tomorrow we want all to come. Everybody. For he respected everybody. He liked everybody. And so it's fitting that his funeral orgies should be public.
And so he went a-mooning on and on, liking to hear himself talk, and every little while he fetched in his funeral orgies again, till the Duke he couldn't stand it no more, so he writes on a little scrap of paper,
Obsequies, you old fool.
and folds it up, and goes to goo-gooing and reaching it over people's heads to him. The king he reads it and puts it in his pocket, and says,
Poor William. afflicted as he is, his heart aluz, right? Asked me to invite everyone to come to the funeral. Wants me to make 'em all welcome. You needn't worry. It was just what I was at.
Then he weaves along again, perfectly calm, and goes to dropping in his funeral orgies again every now and then, just like he done before. And when he done it the third time, he says,
I say orgies, not because it's a common term, because it ain't. Obsequies being the common term, but because orgies is the right term. Obsequies ain't used in England no more now. It's gone out. We say orgies in England. Orgies is better because it means the thing you're after more exact. It's a word that's made up outen the Greek orgo, outside, open, abroad, and the Hebrew jism, to plant, cover up, hence inter. So you see, funeral orgies is an open or public funeral.
he was the worst I ever struck. Well, the iron-jawed man, he laughed right in his face. Everybody was shocked. Everybody says,
Why,
Doctor.
Doctor!
and Abner Shackelford says,
Why, Robinson, hain't you heard the news? This is Harvey Wilkes.
the king, he smiled eager, and shoved out his flapper, and says,
Is it my poor brother's dear good friend and physician?
Keep your hands off of me.
says the doctor.
You talk like an Englishman, don't you? It's the worst imitation I ever heard. You, Peter Wilkes' brother. You're a fraud, that's what you are.
Well, how they all took on. They crowded around the doctor and tried to quiet him down, and tried to explain to him and tell him how Harvey'd showed in 40 ways that he was Harvey, and knowed everybody by name, and the names of the very dogs, and begged him not to hurt Harvey's feelings and the poor girl's feelings, and all that. But it weren't no use. He stormed right along, and said any man that pretended to be an Englishman and couldn't imitate the lingo no better than what he did was a fraud and a liar. The poor girls was hanging to the king and crying, and all of a sudden the doctor ups and turns on them. He says,
I was your father's friend, and I'm your friend, and I warn you as a friend and an honest one that wants to protect you and keep you out of harm and trouble, to turn your backs on that scoundrel and have nothing to do with him, the ignorant tramp, with his idiotic Greek and Hebrew, as he calls it. He is the thinnest kind of an impostor, has come here with a lot of empty names and facts which he picked up somewhere, and you take them for proofs, and are helped to fool yourselves by these foolish friends here who ought to know better. Mary Jane Wilkes, you know me for your friend, and for your unselfish friend, too. Now listen to me. Turn this pitiful rascal out. I beg you to do it. Will you?
Mary Jane straightened herself up, and but she was handsome. She says,
Here is my answer.
she hove up the bag of money and put it in the king's hands, and says,
Take this $6,000 and invest for me and my sisters any way you want to, and don't give us no receipt for it.
Then she put her arm around the king on one side, and Susan and the harelip done the same on t'other. Everybody clapped their hands and stomped on the floor like a perfect storm, while the king held up his head and smiled proud. The doctor says,
All right. I wash my hands of the matter. But I warn you all that a time is coming when you're going to feel sick whenever you think of this day.
and away he went.
All right, Doctor.
Says the king, kinder mocking him,
We'll try and get 'em to send for you.
which made them all laugh, and they said it was a prime good hit. End of chapter 25. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 26. A Pious King. The King's Clergy. She asked his pardon. Hiding in the room. Huck takes the money. Well, when they was all gone, the King he asked Mary Jane how they was off for spare rooms, and she said she had one spare room, which would do for Uncle William, and she'd give her own room to Uncle Harvey, which was a little bigger, and she would turn into the room with her sisters and sleep on a cot, and up garret was a little cubby with a pallet in it. The King said the cubby would do for his valet, meaning me. So Mary Jane took us up, and she showed them her rooms, which was plain but nice. She said she'd have her frocks and a lot of other traps took out of her room if they was in Uncle Harvey's way, but he said they weren't. The frocks was hung along the wall, and before them was a curtain made out of calico that hung down to the floor. There was an old hair trunk in one corner, and a guitar box in another, and all sorts of little knick-knacks and gimcracks around, like girls brisking up a room with. The King said it was all the more homely and more pleasanter for these fixins, and so don't disturb them. The Duke's room was pretty small, but plenty good enough, and so was my cubby. That night they had a big supper, and all them men and women was there, and I stood behind the King in the Duke's chairs and waited on them, and the niggers waited on the rest. Mary Jane, she sat at the head of the table, with Susan alongside her, and said how bad the biscuits was, and how mean the preserves was, and how ornery and tough the fried chickens was, and all that kind of rot, the way women always do, for to force out compliments, and the people all knowed everything was tip-top, and said so, said,
How do you get biscuits to brown so nice?
and
Where for the land's sake did you get these amazing pickles?
and all that kind of humbug, talkety-talk, just the way people always does at a supper, you know. And when it was all done, me and the harelip had supper in the kitchen off of the leavings, whilst others was helping the niggers clean up the things. The harelip, she got to pumping me about England, and I blessed if I didn't think the ice was getting mighty thin sometimes. She says,
Did you ever see the king?
Who, William IV? Well, I bet I have. He goes to our church. I knowed he was dead years ago, but I never let on. So when I says he goes to our church, she says,
What, regular?
Yes, regular. His pew's right over opposite ourn, on t'other side of the pulpit.
I thought he lived in London.
Well, he does. Where would he live?
But I thought you lived in Sheffield.
I see I was up a stump. I had to let on to get choked with a chicken bone, so as to get time to think how to get down again. Then I says, I mean he goes to our church regular when he's in Sheffield. That's only in the summertime, when he comes there to take the sea baths.
Why, how you talk! Sheffield ain't on the sea.
Well, who said it was?
Why, you did.
I didn't nuther.
You did.
I didn't.
You did.
I never said nothing of the kind.
Well, what did you say then?
Said he come to take sea baths. That's what I said.
Well, then, how's he going to take the sea baths if it ain't on the sea?
Looky here, I says. Did you ever see any Congress water?
Yes.
Well, did you have to go to Congress to get it?
Why, no.
Well, neither does William IV have to go to the sea to get a sea bath.
How does he get it then?
Gets it the way people down here gets Congress water, in barrels. They're in the palace at Sheffield. They've got furnaces, and he wants his water hot. They can't bile that amount of water away off there at the sea. They haven't got no conveniences for it.
Oh, I see now. You might have said that in the first place and saved time.
When she said that, I see I was out of the woods again, and so I was comfortable and glad. Next she says,
Do you go to church too?
Yes, regular.
Where do you sit?
Why, in our pew.
Whose pew?
Why, ourn. Your Uncle Harvey's.
His'n? What does he want with a pew?
Wants it to sit in. What did you reckon he wanted with it?
Why, I thought he'd be in the pulpit.
Rot him. I forgot he was a preacher. I see I was up a stump again, so I played another chicken bone and got another think. Then I says, blame it, do you suppose there ain't but one preacher to a church?
Why, what do they want with more?
What? To preach before a king? I never did see such a girl as you. They don't have no less than 17.
17, my land! Why, I wouldn't set out such a string as that, not if I never got to glory. It must take 'em a week.
Shucks, they don't all of 'em preach the same day. Only one of 'em.
Well, then what does the rest of 'em do?
Oh, nothing much. Loll around, pass the plate, and one thing or another. But mainly, they don't do nothing.
Well, then what are they for?
Why, they're for style. Don't you know nothing?
Well, I don't want to know such foolishness as that. How is servants treated in England? Do they treat 'em better than we treat our niggers?
No, a servant ain't nobody there. They treat them worse than dogs.
Don't they give 'em holidays the way we do, Christmas and New Year's week and 4th of July?
Oh, just listen. A body could tell you hain't ever been to England by that. Why, why, Joanna, they never see a holiday from year's end to year's end. Never go to the circus, nor theatre, nor nigger shows, nor nowheres.
Nor church?
Nor church.
But you always went to church.
Well, I was gone up again. I forgot I was a old man's servant, but next minute I whirled in on a kind of explanation. How a valet was different from a common servant, and had to go to church whether he wanted to or not, and set with the family, on account of his being the law. But I didn't do it pretty good, and when I got done, I see she wasn't satisfied. She says,
Honest Injun, now, hain't you been telling me a lot of lies?
honest Injun, I says.
None of it at all?
None of it at all. Not a lie in it, says I.
Lay your hand on this book and say it.
I see it weren't nothing but a dictionary, so I laid my hand on it and said it. So then she looked a little better satisfied, and says,
Well, then, I'll believe some of it, but I hope to gracious if I'll believe the rest.
What is it you won't believe, Joe?
says Mary Jane, stepping in with Susan behind her.
It ain't right nor kind for you to talk so to him, and him a stranger, and so far from his people. How would you like to be treated so?
That's always your way, Mame, always sailing in to help somebody before they're hurt. I ain't done nothin' to him. He's told some stretchers, I reckon, and I said I wouldn't swallow it all, and that's every bit and green I did say. I reckon he can stand a little thing like that, can't he?
I don't care whether 'twas little or whether 'twas big. He's here in our house and a stranger, and it wasn't good of you to say it. If you was in his place it would make you feel ashamed, and so you oughtn't to say a thing to another person that will make them feel ashamed.
Why, Marn, he said—
It don't make no difference what he said. That ain't the thing. The thing is for you to treat him kind, and not to be saying things to make him remember he ain't in his own country and amongst his own folks.
I says to myself, this is a girl that I'm letting that old reptile rob her of her money. Then Susan, she waltzed in, and if you believe me, she did give Harelip Hark from the tomb. Says I to myself, and this is another one that I'm letting him rob her of her money. Then Mary Jane, she took another inning, and went in sweet and lovely again, which was her way. But when she got done, there weren't hardly anything left of poor Harelip, so she hollered,
All right then,
says the other girls.
You just ask his pardon.
She done it too, and she done it beautiful. She done it so beautiful it was good to hear, and I wished I could tell her 1,000 lies. so she could do it again. I says to myself, this is another one that I'm letting him rob her of her money. And when she got through, they all just laid theirselves out to make me feel at home and know I was amongst friends. I felt so ornery and low down and mean that I says to myself, my mind's made up. I'll have that money for them or bust. So then I lit out, for bed, I said, meaning some time or another. When I got by myself, I went to thinking the thing over. I says to myself, shall I go to that doctor, private, and blow on those frauds? No, that won't do. He might tell whom told him. Then the king and the duke would make it warm for me. Shall I go private and tell Mary Jane? No, I dasn't do it. Her face would give them a hint, sure. They've got the money, and they'd slide right out and get away with it. If she was to fetch in help, I'd get mixed up in the business before it was done with, I judge. No, there ain't no good way but one. I got to steal that money somehow, and I got to steal it some way they won't suspicion that I done it. They got a good thing here, and they ain't a-going to leave till they've played this family and this town for all they're worth, so I'll find a chance time enough. I'll steal it and hide it, and by, when I'm away down the river, I'll write a letter and tell Mary Jane where it's hid. But I better have it tonight if I can, because the doctor maybe hasn't let up as much as he lets on he has. He might scare them out of here yet. So, thinks I, I'll go and search them rooms. Upstairs the hall was dark, but I found the Duke's room, and started a paw around it with my hands. But I recollected it wouldn't be much like the king to let anybody else take care of that money but his own self. So then I went to his room and began to paw around there. But I see I couldn't do nothing without a candle, and I doesn't light one, of course. So I judged I got to do the other thing, lay for them and eavesdrop. About that time I hears their footsteps coming, and was going to skip under the bed. I reached for it, but it wasn't where I thought it would be. But I touched the curtain that hid Mary Jane's frocks, so I jumped in behind that and snuggled in amongst the gowns, and stood there perfectly still. They come in and shut the door, and the first thing the Duke done was to get down and look under the bed. Then I was glad I hadn't found the bed when I wanted it. And yet, it's kind of natural to hide under the bed when you are up to anything private. They sits down then, and the king says,
Well, what is it? And cut it middlin' short, because it's better for us to be down there a-whoopin' up the mornin' than up here giving 'em a chance to talk us over.
Well, this is it, Capet. I ain't easy. I ain't comfortable. That doctor lays on my mind. I wanted to know your plans. I've got a notion, and I think it's a sound one.
What is it, Duke?
That we better glide out of this before 3 in the morning, and clip it down the river with what we've got. Specially seeing we got it so easy. Given back to us, flung at our heads, as you may say, when of course we allowed to have to steal it back. I'm for knocking off and lighting out.
That made me feel pretty bad. About an hour or two ago it would have been a little different, but now it made me feel bad and disappointed. The king rips out and says,
What? And not sell out the rest of the property? March off like a passel of fools and leave $8,000 or $9,000 worth of property laying around just suffering to be scooped in? And all good, saleable stuff, too?
The Duke, he grumbled, and the bag of gold was enough, and he didn't want to go no deeper. Didn't want to rob a lot of orphans of everything they had.
Why, how you talk?
Says the king.
We shan't rob 'em of nothing at all but just this money. The people that buys the property is the sufferers, because as soon as it's found out that we didn't own it, which won't be long after we've slid, the sale won't be valid, and it'll all go back to the estate. These orphans will get the house back again, and that's enough for them. They're young and spry and can easily earn a living. They ain't a-going to suffer. Why, just think, there's thousands and thousands that ain't nigh so well off. Bless you, they ain't got nothing to complain of.
Well, the king, he talked Tim blind, so at last he'd give in, and said all right, but said he believed it was blamed foolishness to stay, and the doctor hanging over them. But the king says,
Curse the doctor. What do we care for him? Ain't we got the fools in town on our side? And ain't that a big enough majority in any town?
so they got ready to go downstairs again. The Duke says,
I don't think we put that money in a good place.
that cheered me up. I'd begun to think I weren't going to get a hint of no kind to help me. The king says,
Why?
Because Mary Jane'll be in mourning from this out. And first, you know, the nigger that does up the rooms will get an order to box these duds up and put 'em away. And do you reckon a nigger can run across money and not borrow some of it?
Your head's level again, Duke,
says the king, and he comes a-fumbling under the curtain 2 or 3 foot from where I was. I stuck tight to the wall and kept mighty still through quivery, and I wondered what them fellows would say to me if they catched me, and I tried to think what I'd better do if they did catch me. But the king, he got the bag before I could think more than about a half a thought, and he never suspicioned I was around. They took and shoved the bag through a rip in the straw tick that was under the feather bed, and crammed it in a foot or 2 amongst the straw, and said it was all right now, because a nigger only makes up the feather bed, and don't turn over the straw tick only about twice a year, and so it weren't in no danger of getting stole now. But I knowed better. I had it out of there before they was halfway downstairs. I groped along up to my cubby, and I hid it there till I could get a chance to do better. I judged I'd better hide it outside of the house somewheres, because if they missed it, they would give the house a good ransacking. I knowed that very well. Then I turned in, with my clothes all on, but I couldn't a-go to sleep, if I'd a-wanted to. I was in such a sweat to get through with the business. By and by I heard the king and the Duke come up, so I rolled off my pallet and laid with my chin at the top of my ladder, and waited to see if anything was going to happen, but nothing did. So I held on till all the late sounds had quit and the early ones hadn't begun yet, and then I slipped down the ladder. End of chapter 26. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 27. The Funeral. Satisfying curiosity. Suspicious of Huck. Quick sales and small. I crept to their doors and listened. They was snoring, so I tiptoed along and got downstairs all right. There weren't a sound anywheres. I peeped through a crack of the dining-room door, and I see the men that was watching the corpse all sound asleep on their chairs. The door was open into the parlor, where the corpse was laying, and there was a candle in both rooms. I passed along, and the parlor door was open, but I see there weren't nobody in there but the remainders of Peter. So I shoved on by, but the front door was locked, and the key wasn't there. Just then I heard somebody coming down the stairs back behind me. I run in the parlor and took a swift look around, and the only place I see to hide the bag was in the coffin. The lid was shoved along about a foot, showing the dead man's face down in there, with a wet cloth over it, and his shroud on. I tucked the money bag in under the lid, just down beyond where his hands was crossed, which made me creep. They was so cold, and then I run back across the room and in behind the door. The person coming was Mary Jane. She went to the coffin very soft and kneeled down and looked in. Then she put up her handkerchief, and I see she begun to cry, though I couldn't hear her, and her back was to me. I slid out, and as I passed the dining room, I thought I'd make sure them watchers hadn't seen me, so I looked through the crack, and everything was all right. They hadn't stirred. I slipped up to bed, feeling rather blue, on account of the thing playing out that way after I had so much trouble and run so much risk about it. Says I, if it could stay where it is, all right, because when we get down the river 100 or a mile or two, I could write back to Mary Jane, and she could dig him up again and get it. But that ain't the thing that's going to happen. The thing that's going to happen is the money will be found when they come to screw on the lid. Then the king'll get it again, and it'll be a long day before he gives anybody another chance to snatch it from him. Of course I wanted to slide down and get it out of there, but I doesn't try it. Every minute it was getting earlier now, and pretty soon some of them watchers would begin to stir, and I might get catched. Catched with $6,000 in my hands that nobody ain't hired me to take care of. I don't wish to be mixed up in so much business as that, I says to myself. When I got downstairs in the morning, the parlor was shut up, and the watchers was gone. There weren't nobody around but the family and the widow Bartley, and our tribe. I watched their faces to see if anything had been happening, but I couldn't tell. Towards the middle of the day, the undertaker come with his man, and they'd set the coffin in the middle of the room, on a couple of chairs, and then set all our chairs in rows, and borrowed more from the neighbors, till the hall and the parlor and the dining room was full. I see the coffin lid was the way it was before, but I doesn't go to look in under it, with folks around. Then the people begun to flock in, and the beats and the girls took seats in front row at the head of the coffin, and for a half an hour the people filed around slow, in single rank, and looked down at the dead man's face a minute, and some dropped in a tear, and it was all very still and solemn, only the girls and the beats, holding handkerchiefs to their eyes and keeping their heads bent, and sobbing a little. There weren't no other sound but the scraping of feet on the floor and blowing noses, because people always blows them more at a funeral than they do at other places except church. When the place was packed full, the undertaker he slid around in his black gloves, with his softly soothing ways, putting on the last touches, and getting people and things all ship-shape and comfortable, and making no more sound than a cat. He never spoke. He moved people around. He squeezed in late ones. He opened up passageways, and done it with nods and signs with his hands. Then he took his place over against the wall. It was the softest, glidingest, stealthiest man I ever did see, and there weren't no more smile to him than there is to a ham. They had borrowed a melodeon, a sick one, and when everything was ready, a young woman set down and worked it. It was pretty streaky and colicky, and everybody joined in and sung, and Peter was the only one that had a good thing, according to my notion. Then the Reverend Hobson opened up, slow and solemn, and began to talk, and straight off the most outrageous row busted out of the cellar a body ever heard. It was only one dog, but he made a most powerful racket, and he kept it up right along. The parson he had to stand there over the coffin and wait. You couldn't hear yourself think. It was right down awkward, and nobody didn't seem to know what to do. But pretty soon they see that long-legged undertaker make a sign to the preacher, as much as to say,
"Don't you worry, just depend on me."
Then he stooped down and begun to glide along the wall, just his shoulders showing over the people's heads. So he glided along, and the powwow and racket getting more and more outrageous all the time, and at last, when he had gone around 2 sides of the room, he disappears down cellar. Then in about 2 seconds we heard a whack, and the dog he finished up with a most amazing howl or two, and then everybody was dead still, and the parson began his solemn talk where he left off. In a minute or two here comes this undertaker's back and shoulders gliding along the wall again. So he glided and glided around the three sides of the room, and then rose up, and shaded his mouth with his hands, and stretched his neck out towards the preacher, over the people's heads, and says in a kind of coarse whisper,
He had a rat.
Then he drooped down and glided along the wall again to his place. You could see it was a great satisfaction to the people, because naturally they wanted to know. A little thing like that don't cost nothing, and it's just the little things that makes a man to be looked up to and liked. There weren't no more popular man in town than what that undertaker was. Well, the funeral sermon was very good, but pissin' long and tiresome. And then the king he shoved in and got off some of his usual rubbage, and at last the job was through, and the undertaker began to sneak up on the coffin with his screwdriver. I was in a sweat then, and watched him pretty keen, but he never meddled at all, just slid the lid along as soft as mush, and screwed it down tight and fast. So there I was. I didn't know whether the money was in there or not. So, says I, suppose somebody has hogged that bag on the sly. Now how do I know whether to write to Mary Jane or not? Suppose she dug him up and didn't find nothing. What would she think of me? Blame it, I says, I might get hunted up and jailed. I'd better lay low and keep dark, and not write at all. The thing's awful mixed now, trying to better it. I've worsened it 100 times, and I wish to goodness I'd just let it alone. Dad fetched the whole business. They buried him, and we come back home, and I went to watching faces again. I couldn't help it, and I couldn't rest easy. But nothing come of it. The faces didn't tell me nothing. The king, he visited around in the evening, and sweetened everybody up, and made himself ever so friendly, and he give out the idea that this congregation over in England would be in a sweat about him, so he must hurry, and settle up the estate right away, and leave for home. He was very sorry he was so pushed, and so was everybody. They wished he could stay longer, but they said they could see it couldn't be done. And he said of course him and William would take the girls home with them, and that pleased everybody too, because then the girls would be well fixed and amongst their own relations, and it pleased the girls too. Tickled them so they clean forgot they ever had a trouble in the world, and told him to sell out as quick as he wanted to. They would be ready. Them poor things was that glad and happy it made my heart ache to see them getting fooled and lied to so, but I didn't see no safe way for me to chip in and change the general tune. Well, blamed if the king didn't bill that house and the niggers and all the property for auction straight off. Sale 2 days after the funeral, but anybody could buy private beforehand if they wanted to. So the next day after the funeral, along about noontime, the girls' joy got first jolt. A couple of nigger traders come along, and the king sold them, the niggers reasonable, for 3-day drafts as they called it, and away they went. The 2 sons up the river to Memphis, and their mother down the river to Orleans. I thought them poor girls and them niggers would break their hearts for grief. They cried around each other, and took on, so it most made me down sick to see it. The girls said they hadn't ever dreamed of seeing the family separated or sold away from the town. I can't ever get it out of my memory, the sight of them poor miserable girls and niggers hanging around each other's necks and crying. And I reckon I couldn't a stood it all, but would a had to bust out and tell on our gang if I hadn't known the sale wouldn't no account and the niggers would be back home in a week or 2. The thing made a big stir in the town, too, and a good many come out flat-footed and said it was scandalous to separate the mother and the children that way. It injured the fraud some, but the old fool, he bowled right along, spite of all the Duke could say or do, and I tell you, the Duke was powerful uneasy. The next day was auction day. About broad day in the morning the king and the duke come up in the garret and woke me up, and I seed by their look that there was trouble. The king says,
Was you in my room night before last?
"No, your majesty," which was the way I always called him when nobody but our gang weren't around.
Was you in there yesterday or last night?
"No, your majesty."
Honor bright now, no lies.
"Honor bright, your majesty, I'm telling you the truth. I hain't been a near your room since Miss Mary Jane took you and the duke and showed it to you." The duke says,
Have you seen anybody else go in there?
"No, your grace, not as I remember, I believe."
Stop and think.
I studied a while, and I sees my chance. Then I says, "Well, I see the niggers go in there several times." Both of them gave a little jump, and looked like they hadn't ever expected it, and then they had. Then the duke says,
What, all of them?
"No, leastways, not all at once, that is. I don't know I ever see them all come out at once but just one time."
Hello, when was that?
"It was the day we had the funeral, in the morning. It weren't early, because I overslept. I was just starting down the ladder, and I see them."
Well, go on, go on. What did they do? How'd they act?
"They didn't do nothing, and they didn't act any way much, as fur as I could see. They tiptoed away, so I seen, easy enough, that they shoved in there to do up your majesty's room, or something, suppose you was up, and found you weren't up, and so they was helping to slide out of the way of trouble without waking you up, if they hadn't already waked you up,"
Great guns, this is a go.
says the king, and both of them looked pretty sick and tolerable silly. They stood there a-thinking and scratching their heads a minute, and the duke he bust into a kind of a little raspy chuckle, and says,
It does beat all how neat the niggers played their hand. They led on to be sorry they was going out of this region. And I believe they was sorry. And so did you. And so did everybody. Don't ever tell me any more that a nigger ain't got any histrionic talent. Why, the way they played that thing, it would fool anybody. In my opinion, there's a fortune in 'em. If I had capital and a theatre, I wouldn't want a better layout than that. And here we've gone and sold 'em for a song. Yes, and ain't privileged to sing the song yet. Say, where is that song? That draft?
"In the bank for to be collected. Where would it be?"
Well, that's all right then. Thank goodness.
Says I, kind of timid like. "Is something gone wrong?" The king whirls on me and rips out,
None of your business. You keep your head shut and mind your own affairs, if you got any. Long as you're in this town, don't you forget that. You hear?
Then he says to the duke,
You got to just swallow it and say nothing. Mum's word for us.
As they was starting down the ladder, the duke he chuckles again and says,
Quick sales and small profits. It's a good business. Yes.
The king snarls around on him and says,
I was trying to do for the best in selling 'em out so quick. If the profits has turned out to be none, lacking considerable, and none to carry, is it my fault any more'n it's yourn?
Well, they'd be in this house yet, and we wouldn't, if I could have got my advice listened to.
The king sassed back as much as was safe for him, and then swapped around and lit into me again. He give me down the banks for not coming and telling him I see the niggers come out of his room acting that way. Said any fool would a knowed something was up, and then waltzed in and cussed himself a while, and said it all come of him not laying late and taking his natural rest that morning, and he'd be blamed if he never do it again. So they went off a-jawing, and I felt dreadful glad I'd worked it all off onto the niggers, and yet hadn't done the niggers no harm by it. End of chapter 27. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 28. The Trip to England. The Brute. Mary Jane decides to leave. Huck's parting with Mary Jane. Mumps. The opposition line. By and by, it was getting up time, so I come down the ladder and started for downstairs. But as I come to the girls' room, the door was open, and I see Mary Jane sitting by her old hair trunk, which was open, and she'd been packing things in it, getting ready to go to England. But she had stopped now, with a folded gown in her lap, and had her face in her hands, crying. I felt awful bad to see it. Of course anybody would. I went in there and says, "Miss Mary Jane, you can't a-bear to see people in trouble, and I can't, most always. Tell me about it." So she done it, and it was the niggers. I just expected it. She said the beautiful trip to England was most about spoiled for her. She didn't know how she was ever going to be happy there, knowing the mother and the children were ever going to see each other no more, and then busted out bitterer than ever, and flung up her hands and says,
"Oh, dear, dear, to think they ain't ever going to see each other any more."
"But they will, and inside of 2 weeks, and I know it," says I. Laws, it was out before I could think, and before I could budge she throws her arms around my neck and she told me to say it again. Say it again, say it again. I see I had spoke too sudden and said too much, and was in a close place. I asked her to let me think a minute, and she sat there, very impatient and excited and handsome, but looking kind of happy and eased up, like a person that had a tooth pulled out. So I went to studying it out. I says to myself, I reckon a body that ups and tells the truth when he is in a tight place is taking considerable many risks, though I ain't had no experience, and can't say for certain, but it looks so to me anyway, and yet there's a case where I'm blessed if it don't look to me like the truth is better and actually safer than a lie. I must lay it by in my mind, and think it over some time or other. So, it's so kind of strange and unregular. I never see nothing like it. Well, I says to myself at last, I'm a-going to chance it. I'll up and tell the truth this time, though it does seem most like sitting down on a keg of powder and touching it off just to see where you'll go to. Then I says, Miss Mary Jane, is there any place out of town a little ways where you could go and stay 3 or 4 days?
Yes, Mr. Lothrop's. Why?
Never mind why yet. If I'll tell you how I know, the niggers will see each other again inside of 2 weeks, here in this house, and prove how I'll know it. Will you go to Mr. Lothrop's and stay 4 days?
4 days?
She says.
I'll stay a year.
All right, I says. I don't want nothing more out of you than just your word. I'd rather have it than another man's kiss the Bible. She smiled and reddened up very sweet, and I says, if you don't mind it, I'll shut the door and bolt it. Then I come back and sit down again and says, don't you holler, just set still and take it like a man. I don't got to tell the truth, and you want to brace up, Miss Mary, because it's a bad kind, and going to be hard to take. But there ain't no help for it. These uncles o' yourn ain't no uncles at all. They're a couple of frauds, regular deadbeats. There, now we're over the worst of it. You can stand the rest middlin' easy. It jolted her up like everything, of course, but I was over the shoal water now, so I went right along, her eyes a-blazin' higher and higher all the time, and told her every blamin' thing, from where we first struck that young fool going up to the steamboat, clear through to where she flung herself onto the king's breast at the front door, and he kissed her 16 or 17 times, and then up she jumps, with her face afire like sunset, and says,
"The brute! Come, don't waste a minute, not a second. We'll have them tarred and feathered and flung in the river."
Says I, certainly. But do you mean before you go to Mr. Lothrop's, or?
Oh,
She says.
what am I thinking about?
She says, and set right down again.
Don't mind what I said. Please don't. You won't, now, will you?
Laying her silky hand on mine in that kind of a way that I said I would die first.
I never thought. I was so stirred up.
She says.
Now go on, and I won't do so any more. You tell me what to do, and whatever you say, I'll do it.
Well, I says, it's a rough gang, them two frauds, and I'm fixed so I got to travel with them a while longer, whether I want to or not. I'd rather not tell you why, and if you was to blow on them this town would get me out of their claws, and I'd be all right. But there'd be another person that you don't know about who'd be in big trouble. Well, we got to save him, hain't we? Of course. Well then, we won't blow on 'em. Saying them words put a good idea in my head. I see how maybe I could get me and Jim rid of the frauds and get them jailed here, and then leave. But I didn't want to run the raft in the daytime without anybody aboard to answer questions but me. So I didn't want the plan to begin working till pretty late tonight. I says, Miss Mary Jane, I'll tell you what we'll do, and you won't have to stay at Mr. Lothrop's so long, nuther. How fur is it?
A little short of 4 miles, right out in the country, back here.
Well, that'll answer. Now you go along out there, and lay low till 9 or half-past tonight, and then get them to fetch you home again. Tell them you thought of something. If you get here before 11, put a candle in this window, and if I don't turn up, wait till 11, and then if it don't turn up, it means I'm gone, and out of the way and safe. Then you come out and spread the news around, and get these beats jailed.
Good,
she says.
I'll do it.
And if it just so happens that I don't get away, but get took up along with 'em, you must stop and say I told you the whole thing beforehand, and you must stand by me all you can.
Stand by you, indeed I will. They shan't touch a hair of your head,
she says, and I see her nostrils spread and her eyes snap when she said it too. If I get away, I shan't be here, I says, to prove these rapscallions ain't your uncles, and I couldn't do it if I was here. I could swear they was beats and bummers. That's all, though that's worth something. Well, there's others can do that better than what I can, and they're people that ain't going to be doubted as quick as I'd be. I'll tell you how to find 'em. Give me a pencil and a piece of paper. There, Royal Nonsuch, Brickville. Put it away, and don't lose it. When the court wants to find out something about those two, let them send up to Bricksville and say they've got the man that played the Royal Nonsuch, and ask for some witnesses. Why, you'll have that entire town down here before you can hardly wink, Miss Mary. And they'll come a-bailing, too. I judged we had got everything fixed about right now, so I says, just let the auction go right along, and don't worry. Nobody don't have to pay for the things they'll buy till a whole day after the auction, on accounts of the short notice, and they ain't going out of this till they got that money. And the way we fixed it, the sale ain't going to court, and they ain't going to get no money. It's just like the way it was with the niggers. Ain't weren't no sale, and the niggers will be back before long. Why, they can't collect the money for the niggers yet. They're in the worst kind of a fix, Miss Mary.
Well,
she says,
I'll run down to breakfast now, and then I'll start straight for Mr. Lothrop's.
Deed, that ain't the ticket, Miss Mary Jane, I says. By no manner of means go before breakfast.
Why?
What did you reckon I wanted you to go at all for, Miss Mary?
Well, I never thought. And come to think, I don't know. What was it?
Why, it's because you ain't one of these leather-faced people. I don't want no better book than what your face is. A body can sit down and read it off like a coarse print. Do you reckon you can go and face your uncles when they come to kiss you good morning and never—
There, there, don't. Yes, I'll go before breakfast. I'll be glad to. And leave my sisters with them?
Yes, never mind about them. They've got to stand it yet a while. They might suspicion something if all of you was to go. I don't want you to see them, nor your sisters, nor nobody in this town. If a neighbor was to ask how is your uncles this morning, your face would tell something. No, you go right along, Miss Mary Jane, and I'll fix it with all of them. I'll tell Miss Susan to give your love to your uncles, and say you've went away for a few hours, for to get a little rest and change, or to see your friend, and you'll be back tonight or early in the morning.
Gone to see a friend is all right, but I won't have my love given to them.
Well then, it shan't be. It was well enough to tell her so, no harm in it. It was only a little thing to do and no trouble, and it's the little things that smooths people's roads the most, down here below. It would make Mary Jane comfortable, and it wouldn't cost nothing. Then I says, there's one more thing, that bag of money.
Well, they've got that, and it makes me feel pretty silly to think how they got it.
No, you're out there. They hain't got it.
Why, who's got it?
I wish I knowed, but I don't. I had it because I stole it from them, and I stole it to give to you, and I know where I hid it, but I'm afraid it ain't there no more. I'm awful sorry, Miss Mary Jane. I'm just as sorry as I can be, but I done the best I could. I did, honest. I come nigh getting caught, and I had to shove it into the first place I come to, and run, and it weren't a good place.
Oh, stop blaming yourself. It's too bad to do it, and I won't allow it. You couldn't help it. It wasn't your fault. Where did you hide it?
I didn't want to set her to thinking about her troubles again, and I couldn't seem to get my mouth to tell her what would make her see that corpse, lying in a coffin, with that bag of money on his stomach. So for a minute I didn't say nothing. Then I says, I'd rather not tell you where I put it, Miss Mary Jane, if you don't mind letting me off, but I'll write it for you on a piece of paper, and you can read it along the road to Miss Lothrop's, if you want to. Do you reckon that'll do?
Oh, yes.
So I wrote, I put it in the coffin. It was in there when you was crying there, away in the night. I was behind the door, and I was mighty sorry for you, Miss Mary Jane. It made my eyes water a little to remember her crying there all by herself in the night, and them devils lying there right under her own roof, shaming her and robbing her. And when I folded it up and give it to her, I see the water come into her eyes too, and she took me by the hand, hard, and says,
Goodbye. I'm going to do everything just as you've told me, and if I don't ever see you again, I shan't ever forget you, and I'll think of you a many and a many a time, and I'll pray for you too.
And she was gone. Pray for me. I reckoned if she knowed me, she'd take a job that was more nearer her size. But I bet she done it just the same. She was just that kind. She had the grit to pray for Judas if she took the notion. There weren't no back down to her, I judge. You may say what you want to, but in my opinion, she had more sand in her than any girl I ever see. In my opinion, she was just full of sand. It sounds like flattery, but it ain't no flattery. And when it comes to beauty and goodness too, she lays over them all. I hain't ever seen her since that time that I see her go out of that door. No, I hain't ever seen her since, but I reckoned I've thought of her a many and a many a million times, and of her saying she would pray for me, and if ever I'd a thought it would do any good for me to pray for her, blamed if I wouldn't a done it, or bust. Well, Mary Jane she lit out the back way, I reckon, because nobody see her go. When I struck Susan and the harelip, I says, What's the name of them people over on the other side of the river that you all goes to see sometimes? They says,
There's several.
But it's the Proctors mainly.
That's the name, I says. I most forgot it. Well, Miss Mary Jane, she told me to tell you she's gone over there in a dreadful hurry. One of them sick.
Which one?
I don't know. Leastways, I kinder forget. But I think it's...
Sakes alive, I hope it ain't Hanner.
I'm sorry to say it, I says, but Hanner's the very one.
My goodness, and she so well only last week. Is she took bad?
It ain't no name for it. They set up with her all night, Miss Mary Jane said, and they don't think she'll last many hours.
Only think of that now.
What's the matter with her?
I couldn't think of anything reasonable right off that way, so I says, mumps.
Mumps your granny. They don't set up with people that's got the mumps.
They don't they? You better bet they'll do with these mumps. These mumps is different. It's a new kind, Miss Mary Jane said.
How's it a new kind?
Because it's mixed up with other things.
What other things?
Well, measles, and whooping cough, and erysipelas, and consumption, and yaller janders, and brain fever, and I don't know what all.
My land! And they call it the mumps?
That's what Miss Mary Jane said.
Well, what in the nation do they call it the mumps for?
Why, because it is the mumps. That's what it starts with.
Well, there ain't no sense in it. A body might stump his toe and take poison, and fall down the well and break his neck and bust his brains out, and somebody come along and ask what killed him, and some numbskull up and say, why, he stumped his toe. Would there be any sense in that? No. And there ain't no sense in this, nuther. Is it catching?
Is it catching? Why, how you talk. It's a harrow catching in the dark. If you don't hitch on to one tooth, you're bound to on another, ain't you? And you can't get away with that tooth without fetching the whole harrow along, can you? Well, these kind of mumps is a kind of a harrow, as you may say, and it ain't no slouch of a harrow, nuther. You come and get it hitched on good.
Well, it's awful, I think,
Says the hare lip.
I'll go to Uncle Harvey and...
Oh, yes, I says, I would. Of course I would. I wouldn't lose no time.
Well, why wouldn't you?
Just look at it a minute, and maybe you can see. Hain't your uncles obleeged to get along home to England as fast as they can? And do you reckon they'd be mean enough to go off and leave you to go all that journey by yourselves? You know they'll wait for you. So fur, so good. Your Uncle Harvey's a preacher, ain't he? Very well, then. Is a preacher going to deceive a steamboat clerk? Is he going to deceive a ship clerk? So as to get them to let Miss Mary Jane go aboard? Now you know he ain't. What will he do then? Why, he'll say, it's a great pity, but my church matters has got to get along the best way they can, for my niece has been exposed to the dreadful paribus unum mumps, and so it's my bounden duty to sit down here and wait the 3 months it takes to show on her if she got it. But never mind if you think it's the best to tell your Uncle Harvey.
Shucks, and stay fooling around here when we could all be having good times in England whilst we was waiting to find out whether Mary Jane's got it or not. Why, you talk like a muggins.
Well, anyway, maybe you'd better tell some of the neighbors.
Listen at that now. You do beat all for natural stupidness. Can't you see that they'd go and tell? There ain't no way but just to not tell anybody at all.
Well, maybe you're right. Yes, I judge you are right.
But I reckon we ought to tell Uncle Harvey she's gone out a while anyway, so he won't be uneasy about her.
Yes, Mary Jane, she wanted you to do that. She says, tell him to give Uncle Harvey and William my love and a kiss, and say I've run over the river to see Mr. What is the name of that rich family of your Uncle Peter used to think so much of? I mean the one that...
Why, you must mean the Apthorps, ain't it?
Of course. Bother them kind of names. A body can't ever seem to remember them, half the time somehow. Yes, she said. Say she has run over for to ask the Anthrops, to be sure, and come to the auction and buy this house, because she allowed her Uncle Peter would rather they had it than anybody else, and she's going to stick to them till they say they'll come, and then, if she ain't too tired, she's coming home, and if she is, she'll be home in the morning anyway. She said, don't say nothing about the Proctors, but only about the Apthrops, which'll be perfectly true, because she's going there to speak about her buying the house. I know it, because she told me so herself.
All right,
they said, and cleared out to lay for their uncles, and give them the love and the kisses and to tell them the message. Everything was all right now. The girls wouldn't say nothing because they wanted to go to England, and the king and the duke would rather Mary Jane was off working for the auction than around in reach of Dr. Robinson. I felt very good. I judged I had done it pretty neat. I reckon Tom Sawyer couldn't have done it no neater himself. Of course he would have throwed more style into it, but I can't do that very handy, not being brung up to it. Well, they held the auction in the public square along towards the end of the afternoon, and strung along. And the old man, he was on hand and looking his level pensionist, up there alongside of the auctioneer, and chipping in a little scripture now and then, or a little goody-goody saying of some kind. And the duke, he was around goo-gooing for sympathy all he knowed how, and just spreading himself generally. But by and by the thing dragged through, and everything was sold, everything but a little old trifling lot in the graveyard. So they'd got to work that off. I never see such a giraffe, as the king was for wanting to swallow everything. Well, whilst they was at it the steamboat landed, and in about 2 minutes up comes a crowd a whooping and yelling and laughing and carrying on and singing out,
Here's your opposition line.
Here's your 2 sets of ears to old Peter Wilkes, and you pays your money and you takes your choice.
End of chapter 28. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 29. Contested Relationship. The King Explains the Loss. A Question of Handwriting. Digging up the Corpse. Huck Escapes. They was fetching a very nice-looking old gentleman along, and a nice-looking younger one, with his right arm in a sling, and my souls, how the people yelled and laughed, and kept it up. But I didn't see no joke about it, and I judged it would strain the duke and the king some to see any. I reckon they'll turn pale, but no, nary a pale did they turn. The duke, he never let on he suspicioned what was up, but just went a goo-gooing around, happy and satisfied, like a jug that's goggling out buttermilk. And as for the king, he just gazed and gazed down sorrowful on them newcomers, like it give him the stomach-ache in his very heart to think there could be such frauds and rascals in the world. Oh, he done it admirable. Lots of principal people gathered around the king to let him see they was on his side. That old gentleman that had just come looked all puzzled to death. Pretty soon he began to speak, and I see straight off he pronounced like an Englishman. Not the king's way, though. The king was pretty good for an imitation. I can't give the old gent's words, nor I can't imitate him. But he turned around to the crowd and says, about like this.
This is a surprise to me which I wasn't looking for, and I'll acknowledge, candid and frank, I ain't very well fixed to meet it and answer it. For my brother and me has had misfortunes. He's broke his arm, and our baggage got put off at a town above here last night in the night by mistake. I am Peter Wilkes's brother Harvey, and this is his brother William, which can't hear nor speak, and can't even make signs to amount to much, now he's only got one hand to work them with. We are who we say we are, and in a day or two, when I get the baggage, I can prove it. But up till then, I won't say nothing more, but go to the hotel and wait.
So him and the new dumbest started off, and the king he laughs. and blithers out.
Broke his arm? Very likely, ain't it? And very convenient, too, for a fraud that's got to make signs and ain't learned how. Lost their baggage? That's mighty good and mighty ingenious under the circumstances.
So he laughed again, and so did everybody else, except 3 or 4, or maybe half a dozen. One of these was that doctor. Another one was a sharp-looking gentleman with a carpet-bag, of the old-fashioned kind made out of carpet stuff, that had just come off of the steamboat, and was talking to him in a low voice, and glancing toward the king now and then and nodding their heads. It was Levi Bell, the lawyer that was gone up to Louisville, and another one was a big rough husky that come along and listened to all the old gentleman said, and was listening to the king now. And when the king got done, this husky up and says,
"Say, looky here. If you are Harvey Wilkes, when'd you come to this town?"
The day before the funeral, friend,
says the king.
"But what time of day?"
in the evening, about an hour or two before sundown.
"How'd you come?"
I come down on the Susan Powell from Cincinnati.
"Well, then, how'd you come to be up at the Pint in the morning in a canoe?"
I weren't up at the Pint in the morning.
"It's a lie."
Several of them jumped for him and begged him not to talk that way to an old man and a preacher.
"Preacher be hanged, he's a fraud and a liar. He was up at the Pint that morning. I live up there, don't I? Well, I was up there and he was up there. I see him there. He come in a canoe along with Tim Collins and a boy."
The doctor, he up and says,
Would you know the boy again if you was to see him, Hines?
"I reckon I would, but I don't know. Why, yonder he is now. I know him perfectly easy."
It was me he pointed at. The doctor says,
Neighbors, I don't know whether the new couple is frauds or not, but if these two ain't frauds, I am an idiot, that's all. I think it's our duty to see that they don't get away from here until we've looked into this thing. Come along, Hines. Come along, the rest of you. We'll take these fellows to the tavern and affront them with t'other couple, and I reckon we'll find out something before we get through.
It was nuts for the crowd, though maybe not for the king's friends, so we all started. It was about sundown. The doctor, he led me along by the hand, and was plenty kind enough, but he never let go of my hand. We all got in a big room in the hotel, and lit up some candles, and fetched in a new couple. First, the doctor says,
I don't wish to be too hard on these two men, but I think they're frauds, and they may have complices that we don't know nothing about. If they have, won't the complices get away with that bag of gold Peter Wilkes left? It ain't unlikely. If these men ain't frauds, they won't object to sending for that money and letting us keep it till they prove they're all right. Ain't that so?
Everybody agreed to that. So I judged they had our gang in a pretty light place right at the outstart. But the king, he only looked sorrowful and says,
Gentlemen, I wish the money was there, for I ain't got no disposition to throw anything in the way of a fair, open, out-and-out investigation of this miserable business. But, alas, the money ain't there, and you can send and see if you want to.
Where is it, then?
Well, when my niece gave it to me to keep for her, I took and hid it inside the straw tick of my bed, not wishing to bank it for the few days we'd be here, and considering the bed a safe place, we not being used to niggers, and suppose honest, like servants in England. The nigger stole it in the very next morning after I went downstairs, and when I told 'em that I hadn't missed the money yet, so they got clean away with it. My servants here can tell you about it, gentlemen.
The doctor and several said,
"Shucks."
And I see nobody didn't altogether believe him. One man asked me if I see the niggers steal it. I said no, but I see them sneaking out of the room and hustling away, and I never thought nothing, only I reckoned They was afraid they had waked up my master, and was trying to get away before he made trouble with them. That was all they asked me. Then the doctor whirls on me and says,
"Are you English too?"
I says yes, and him and some others laughed and said,
Stuff.
Well, then they sailed in on the general investigation, and there we had it, up and down, hour in, hour out, and nobody ever said a word about supper, nor even seemed to think about it, and so they kept it up, and kept it up, and it was the worst mixed-up thing you ever see. They made the king tell his yarn, and they made the old gentleman tell his'n, and anybody but a lot of prejudiced chuckleheads would 'a' seen that the old gentleman was spinning truth and t'other one lies. And by they had me up to tell what I knowed. The king he gave me a left-handed look out of the corner of his eye, and so I knowed enough to talk on the right side. I began to tell about Sheffield, and how we lived there, and all about the English Wilkses, and so on, but I didn't get pretty fur, till the doctor begun to laugh, and Levy Bell, the lawyer, says,
"Set down, my boy. I wouldn't strain myself if I was you. I reckon you ain't used to lying. It don't seem to come handy. What you want is practice. You do it pretty awkward."
I didn't care much for the compliment, but I was glad to be let off anyway. The doctor he started to say something, and turns and says,
"If you'd been in town at first, Levi Bell—"
The king broke in and reached out his hand and says,
Why, is it my poor dead brother's old friend that he's wrote so often about?
The lawyer and him shook hands, and the lawyer smiled and looked pleased, and they talked right along a while, and then got to one side and talked low, and at last the lawyer speaks up and says,
"That'll fix it. I'll take the order and send it, along with your brothers, and then they'll know it's all right."
So they got some paper and a pen, and the king he sat down and twisted his head to one side, and chawed his tongue, and scrawled off something, and then they give the pen to the duke, and then for the first time the duke looked sick, but he took the pen and wrote. So then the lawyer turns to the new old gentleman and says,
"You and your brother, please write a line or two and sign your names."
The old gentleman wrote, but nobody couldn't read it. The lawyer looked powerful astonished and says,
"Well, it beats me,"
and snaked a lot of old letters out of his pocket, and examined them, and then examined the old man's writing, and then them again, and then says,
"These old letters is from Harvey Wilkes. And here's these two handwritings, and anybody can see they didn't write them."
The king and the duke looked sold and foolish, I tell you. I see how the lawyer had took them in.
"And here's this old gentleman's handwriting, and anybody can tell, easy enough, he didn't write them. Fact is, the scratches he makes ain't properly writing at all. Now here's some letters from—"
The new old gentleman says,
"If you please, let me explain. Nobody can read my hand but my brother there, so he copies for me. It's his hand you've got there, not mine."
"Well,"
says the lawyer,
"this is a state of things. I've got some of William's letters, too. So if you'll get him to write a line or so, we can come—"
"He can't write with his left hand,"
says the old gentleman.
"If he could use his right hand, you would see that he wrote his own letters, and mine too. Look at both, please. They're by the same hand."
The lawyer done it and says,
"I believe it's so. And if it ain't so, there's a heap stronger resemblance than I'd noticed before, anyway. Well, 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 I thought we was right on the track of a solution, but it's gone to grass partly. But anyway, one thing is proved. These two ain't either of 'em Wilkses."
And he wagged his head toward the king and the duke, Well, what do you think? That mule-headed old fool wouldn't give in then. Indeed he wouldn't. Said it weren't no fair test. Said his brother William was the cussedest joker in the world, and hadn't tried to write. He see William was going to play one of his jokes the minute he put the pen to paper, and so he warmed up and went warbling and warbling right along till he was actually beginning to believe what he was saying himself. But pretty soon the new gentleman broke in and says,
I've thought of something. Is there anybody here that helped to lay out the late Peter Wilkes for burying?
Yes,
says somebody.
me and Ab Turner done it. We're both here.
Then the old man turns toward the king and says,
Perhaps this gentleman can tell me what was tattooed on his breast.
Blamed if the king didn't have to brace up mighty quick, or he'd a squished down like a bluff bank that the river has cut under. It took him so sudden, and mind you, it was a thing that was calculated to make most anybody squash to get fetched such a solid one as that without any notice, because how was he going to know what was tattooed on that man? He whitened a little, he couldn't help it, and it was mighty still in there, and everybody bending a little forwards and gazing at him. Says I to myself, now he'll throw up the sponge. There ain't no more use. Well, did he? A body can't hardly believe it, but he didn't. I reckoned he thought he'd keep the thing up till he tired them people out, so they'd thin out, and him and the Duke could break loose and get away. Anyway, he set there, and pretty soon he begun to smile, and says,
It's a very tough question, ain't it? Yes, sir. I can tell you what's tattooed on his breast. It's just a small, thin blue arrow. That's what it is. And if you don't look close, you can't see it. Now, what do you say, hey?
Well, I never see anything like that old blister for clean out-and-out cheek. The new old gentleman turns brisk towards Ab Turner and his pard, and his eyes light up like he judged he got the king this time, and says,
There, you've heard what he said. Was there any such mark on Peter Wilkes's breast?
Both of them spoke up and says,
We didn't see no such mark.
Good,
says the old gentleman.
Now, what you did see on his breast was a small, dim P, and a B, which is an initial he dropped when he was young, and a W, with dashes between them. So, P-B-W.
And he marked them that way on a piece of paper.
Come, ain't that what you saw?
Both of them spoke up again and says,
No, we didn't.
We never seen any marks at all.
Well, everybody was in a state of mind now, and they sings out,
The whole billin' of 'em's frauds.
Let's duck 'em.
Let's drown 'em.
Let's ride him on a rail.
And everybody was whooping at once, and there was a rattling powwow. But the lawyer, he jumps on the table and yells and says,
Gentlemen, gentlemen, hear me just a word. Just a single word, if you please. There's one way yet. Let's go and dig up the corpse and look.
That took 'em.
Hooray!
They all shouted, and was starting right off, but the lawyer and the doctor sung out,
Hold on.
Collar all these four men and the boy and fetch them along too.
We'll do
it.
They all shouted.
And if we don't find the marks, we'll lynch the whole gang.
I was scared now, I tell you, but there weren't no getting away, you know. They gripped us all and marched us right along straight for the graveyard, which was 1.5 miles down the river, and the whole town at our heels, for we made noise enough, and it was only 9 in the evening. As we went by our house, I wished I hadn't seen Mary Jane out of town, because now if I could tip her the wink, she'd light out and save me, and blow on our dead beats. Well, we swarmed along down the river road, just carrying on like wildcats, and to make it more scary, the sky was darkening up, and the lightning beginning to wink and flitter, and the wind to shiver amongst the leaves. This was the most awful trouble and the most dangersome I ever was in, and I was kinder stunned. Everything was going so different from what I had allowed for. 'Stead of being fixed so I could take my own time if I wanted to, and see all the fun, and have Mary Jane at my back to save me and set me free when the close fit come. Here was nothing in the world betwixt me and sudden death, but just them tattoo marks. If they didn't find them. I couldn't bear to think about it, and yet somehow I couldn't think about nothing else. It got darker and darker, and it was a beautiful time to give the crowd the slip. But that big husky had me by the wrist, Hans, and a body might as well try to give Gollier the slip. He dragged me right along, he was so excited, and I had to run to keep up. When they got there they swarmed into the graveyard and washed over it like an overflow, and when they got to the grave they found they had about 100 times as many shovels as they wanted, but nobody hadn't thought to fetch a lantern. But they sailed into digging anyway, by the flicker of the lightning, and set a man to the nearest house, a half a mile off, to borrow one. So they dug and dug like everything, and it got awful dark, and the rain started, and the wind whished and swished along, and the lightning come blisker and blisker, and the thunder boomed, and then people never took no notice of it. They was so full of this business, and one minute you could see everything and every face in that big crowd, and the shovelfuls of dirt sailing up out of the grave, and the next second the dark whipped it all out, and you couldn't see nothing at all. At last they got out the coffin and begun to unscrew the lid, and then such another crowding and shouldering and shoving as there was to scrooge in and get a sight you never see, and in the dark that way it was awful. Hans he hurt my wrist dreadful pulling and tugging so, and I reckon he clean forgot I was in the world, he was so excited and panting. All of a sudden the lightning let go a perfect sluice of white glare, and somebody sings out,
By the living jingo! Here's the bag of gold on his breast.
Hans let out a whoop like everybody else, and dropped my wrist and gave a big surge to bust his way in and get a look, and the way I let out and shined for the road in the dark there ain't nobody can tell. I had the road all to myself, and I fairly flew, leastways. I had it all to myself except the solid dark, and the now and then glares, and the buzzing of the rain, and the thrashing of the wind, and the splitting of the thunder, and sure as you are born I did clip it along. When I struck the town I see there weren't nobody out in the storm, so I never hunted for no back streets, but humped it straight through the main one, and when I begun to get towards our house I aimed my eye and set it. No light there, the house all dark, which made me feel sorry and disappointed, I don't know why. But at last, just as I was sailing by, flash comes the light in Mary Jane's window, and my heart swelled up sudden, like to burst, and the same second the house and all was behind me in the dark, and wasn't ever going to be before me no more in this world. She was the best girl I ever see, and had the most sand. The minute I was far enough above the town to see I could make the towhead, I began to look sharp for a boat to borrow, and the first time the lightning showed me one that wasn't chained I snatched it and shoved. It was a canoe, and weren't fastened with nothing but a rope. The towhead was a rattling big distance off, away out there in the middle of the river, but I didn't lose no time, and when I struck the raft at last I was so fagged I would have just laid down to blow and gasp if I could afford it, but I didn't. As I sprung aboard, I sung out, "Out with you, Jim, and set her loose. Glory be to goodness, we're shut of them." Jim lit out, and was a comin' for me with both arms spread, he was so full of joy. But when I glimpsed him in the lightnin', my heart shot up in my mouth, and I went overboard backwards. For I forgot he was old King Lear and a drownded Arab all in one, and it was most scared the livers and lights out of me. But Jim fished me out, and was going to hug me and bless me, and so on. He was so glad I was back, and we was shut of the King and the Duke, but I says, "Not now. Have it for breakfast. Cut loose and let her slide." So in 2 seconds away we went a sliding down the river, and it did seem so good to be free again, and all by ourselves on the big river, and nobody to bother us. I had to skip around a bit, and jump up and crack my heels a few times. I couldn't help it. But about the third crack, I noticed a sound that knowed mighty well, and held my breath and listened and waited, and sure enough, when the next flash busted out over the water, here they come, and just a laying to their oars and making their skiff hum. It was the King and the Duke. So I wilted right down on the planks then, and give up, and it was all I could do to keep from crying. End of chapter 29. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 30. The King went for him. A royal row. Powerful mellow. When they got aboard, the King went for me. He shook me by the collar and says,
Trying to give us the slip, was he? You pup? Tired of our company, hey?
I says, "No, your Majesty, we weren't. Please don't, your Majesty."
Quick then, and tell us what was your idea, or I'll shake the insides out o' you.
"Honest, I tell you everything just as it happened, your Majesty. The man that had a holt of me was very good to me, and kept saying he had a boy about as big as me that died last year, and he was sorry to see a boy in such a dangerous fix. And when they was all took by surprise by finding the gold, and made a rush for the coffin, he let go of me and whispers, 'Heel it now, or they'll hang ye, sure,' and I lit out. It didn't seem no good for me to stay. I couldn't do nothing, and I didn't want to be hung if they could get away. So I never stopped running till I found the canoe, and when I got there I told Jim to hurry, or they'd catch me and hang me yet, and said I was afraid you and the Duke weren't alive now, and I was awful sorry, and so was Jim, and was awful glad when we see you coming. You may ask Jim if I didn't. Jim said it was so, and the King told him to shut up, and said,
Oh yes, it's mighty likely.
And shook me up again, and said he reckoned he drowned me. But the Duke says,
"Let go the boy, you old idiot. Would you have done any different? Did you inquire round for him when you got loose? I don't remember it."
So the King let go of me, and begun to cuss that town and everybody in it. But the Duke says,
"You'd better a blame sight give yourself a good cussing, for you're the one that's entitled to it most. You ain't done a thing from the start that had any sense in it, except coming out so cool and cheeky with that imaginary blue arrow mark. That was bright. It was right down bully, and it was the thing that saved us. For if it hadn't been for that, they'd have jailed us till them Englishmen's baggage come, and then the penitentiary, you bet. But that trick took 'em to the graveyard, and the gold done us a still bigger kindness. For if the excited fools hadn't let go all holts and made that rush to get a look, we'd have slept in our cravats tonight. Cravats warranted to wear, too, longer than we'd need 'em."
They was still a minute, thinking. Then the King says, kind of absent-minded like,
Miff, and we reckon the niggers stole it.
That made me squirm.
"Yes,"
says the Duke. kinder slow and deliberate and sarcastic.
We did.
After about a half a minute, the king drawls out.
Leastways, I did.
The Duke says the same way.
On the contrary, I did.
The king kind of ruffles up and says,
Looky here, Bilgewater. What are you referring to?
The Duke says pretty brisk.
When it comes to that, maybe you'll let me ask, what was you referring to?
Shucks,
says the king, very sarcastic.
But I don't know. Maybe you was asleep and didn't know what you was about.
The Duke bristles up now and says,
Oh, let up on this cussed nonsense. Do you take me for a blame fool? Don't you reckon I know who hid that money in that coffin?
Yes, sir. I know you do know, because you done it yourself.
It's a lie!
And the Duke went for him. The king sings out,
Take your hands off. Let go my throat. I take it all back.
The Duke says,
Well, you just own up first that you did hide that money there, intending to give me the slip one of these days and come back and dig it up and have it all to yourself.
Wait just 1 minute, Duke. Answer me this one question, honest and fair. If you don't put the money there, say it, and I'll believe you, and take back everything I said.
You old scoundrel. I didn't. You know I didn't. There, now.
Well then, I believe you. But answer me only just this one more. Now, don't get mad. Didn't you have it in your mind to hook the money and hide it?
The Duke never said nothing for a little bit. Then he says,
Well, I don't care if I did. I didn't do it anyway. But you not only had it in mind to do it, but you done it.
I wish I'd never die if I done it, Duke, and that's honest. I wouldn't say I weren't going to do it, because I was, but you, I mean someone, got in ahead of me.
It's a lie. You done it, and you've got to say you done it, or...
The king began to gurgle, and then he gasps out,
No, I own up.
I was very glad to hear him say that. It made me feel much more easier than what I was feeling before. So the Duke took his hands off and says,
If you ever deny it again, I'll drown you. It's well for you to set there and blubber like a baby. It's fitting for you, after the way you've acted. I never see such an old ostrich for wanting to gobble everything, and I a trusting you all the time, like you was my own father. You ought to been ashamed of yourself to stand by and hear it saddled onto a lot of poor niggers. And you never say a word for 'em. It makes me feel ridiculous to think I was soft enough to believe that rubbish. Cuss you, I can see now why you were so anxious to make up the deficit. You wanted to get what money I'd got out of the nonsuch and one thing or another and scoop it all.
The king says, timid, and still a snuffing,
Why, Duke, it was you that said make up the deficit. It weren't me.
Dry up. I don't want to hear no more out of you,
says the Duke.
And now you see what you got by it? They've got all their own money back and all of ourn but a shekel or two besides. Go along to bed, and don't you deficit me no more deficits long's you live.
So the king sneaked into the wigwam and took to his bottle for comfort, and before long the Duke tackled his bottle, and so in about a half an hour they was as thick as thieves again, and the tighter they got, the lovinger they got, and went off a-snoring in each other's arms. They both got powerful mellow, but I noticed the king didn't get mellow enough to forget to remember to not deny about hiding the money bag again. That made me feel easy and satisfied. Of course, when they got to snoring, we had a long gabble, and I told Jim everything. End of chapter 30.